Hello and welcome to this ICA in Conversation that broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month and focuses on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter financial crime. I'm Ben Jones, and coming up, we're going to be discussing process optimization. If you've ever found yourself drowning in false positives, wrestling with legacy systems, or have a backlog of cases, then this session is for you. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Madhav Manek, who is an associate partner at PA Consulting. Madhav has initiated several transformational strategies and helped senior leaders make their financial crimes more efficient. As always, I'm interested to know your questions, so please send them in and I'll try and look at them as we go through this session. So, Madhav, to start with, can you tell us a little bit about process optimization and how does this apply to financial crime?
Absolutely. And thanks, Ben, for having me on this discussion. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. And I think it's an important one because what we face often in organizations and when I'm speaking to leaders across the industry, what this conversation will do is really open up the hood on one of the most persistent headaches and challenges, which is how do we become more effective at fighting financial crime? And it's no secret that financial institutions spend billions on cumbersome, often ineffective, labor-intensive compliance operations. And it really drains the entire business often. And so the focus of process optimization and why this strategy, something that really changed manufacturing decades ago, might be the exact tool that we need to fix banking's financial crime engine, but also other wider functions within an organization. At its core, what the premise behind process optimization is to say the process sits at the heart of the operating model. Every organization, every institution, every function focuses on execution of a process, and the component parts of your operating model, your people, your technology, ultimately are there to facilitate the execution of that process. So when it comes to optimizing and focusing on what should we change and what should we enhance, if you focus on the process first, then the other parts of your operating model will then improve naturally to facilitate that process. So the focus today for me is to really talk about three key aspects of process optimization in terms of the data-driven principles behind it and how it actually delivers measurable value, something we can definitely talk about in more detail. I think it's also worth talking about where in compliance it actually works. So which processes are the key processes to focus in on. And then I think critically, the third thing which perhaps hasn't been explored as much is why when financial services, an industry that swims in data, has been so slow to adopt this concept when you compare it to, say, others like telecoms or logistics, and what some of the logic behind that might be. The reality is the status quo just doesn't work, right? We've seen massive investments in technology, in screening tools, in AI, but that doesn't necessarily translate into genuine effectiveness. And you see many organizations are stuck in this loop of tick box compliance where they're satisfying the regulations, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're stopping the bad guys. And that inefficiency is staggering. And you mentioned it, false positive alerts. If you just look at that metric, there's an inherent issue across the industry, and analysts in every organization. I can't imagine there's many analysts that are happy about how many false positives they have to deal with, but they are drowning in many organizations. And to be honest with you, it's not a statistic that's getting much better. There is a macro problem here, and process optimization could just be one of the key things that unlocks it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the starting point for process optimization is really to map out the various processes. How is that different from just drawing workflows on, say, a whiteboard?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if we think about process optimization, it's often driven by this thing called process mining, and you may have heard of process mining. Think of process mining as effectively taking an MRI of your organization's operational spine, right? It's the whole point of this is to effectively create a digital twin, a visual representation of what's really happening, not relying on that flowchart someone once drew up years ago and put away in a folder and that everyone seems to have forgotten about. The reality is process mining pulls real data from event logs, from your underlying systems, whether that's CRM, whether that's your transaction monitoring systems or your case management solutions. So every single time-stamped action, every click, every approval, every handoff, and each of those digital breadcrumbs comes together in almost this unbiased audit trail. And what process mining does is reconstructs that into a data-driven picture, a true visualization of the actual process and how things really get done. And the purpose behind that is to then shine a light on every costly detour, every hidden bottleneck, every needless rework that nobody even knew was happening, to then get you to drive your transformation, right? And ultimately, you have to get that right to then get your operating model right. Because if you just start layering new technology onto a bad process, it's just going to make that bad process even faster, if not actually embedding the flaws within that process.
Yeah, indeed. So let's think about the practical side of things. We know that the banks spend millions and millions on KYC, on financial crime controls. If they were to stop spending that time and actually start trying to identify the process optimization, isn't that going to create a backlog? What's the trade-off in terms of optimization?
Yeah, it's a really pertinent point, right? I think there is a tension there, and I think as a result, it's why leadership and strategy are so key here. So if you simply, as I mentioned, look to automate a bad process, you just risk making bad outcomes happen faster or even at a greater scale. But by using process mining first, I'm not saying boil the ocean. I'm saying let it identify, say, the 10 critical bottlenecks that are maybe driving 80% of some of your cost or your inefficiencies. You prioritize surgical fixes. You don't come to a total standstill. And I guess if you reframe it in that way, it's not about stopping everything or stopping your operation. It's about targeted intervention based on data. So using the data to help you drive to the bottlenecks that are really causing delays or operational burdens, to then say, how do we pinpoint and hone in on that particular issue, unblock it, and create operational efficiencies? So the value there is where it starts to really get unlocked.
So you've spoken about bottlenecks and problems with processes. Once these have been identified, once there's some transparency over the process, can I ask, what is the measurable value that organizations can realistically expect once this has been identified?
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, I think when it comes to technology or when it comes to process optimization, value is often the metric people want to discuss and say, how do I see a return on my investment? What does this actually mean for my underlying function? And I think the value proposition specific to process optimization is honestly stunningly concrete. So we're talking about reducing rework, standardizing operations, identifying exact points at which intelligent automation will have the biggest impact. So if I give you an example, so recently a global retail bank, they optimized their handling of fraudulent claim approvals. So they were looking at they used process mining insight to effectively reduce their fraudulent claim approvals by 21%. But if you just think about that as one statistic and then say, actually, what that specific process fix led to was actually millions in operational savings. So the value that you get from applying a concept like process optimization is way beyond just the regulatory tick box. The operational impact it has on the organization is huge. And then the tipping point comes, and we can talk about this perhaps later when it comes to scaling this, but the tipping point comes when you start adding more and more processes into that data-driven digital view, because you start seeing the interconnectivity between those processes, and that's when you start driving real real value.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we're going to come on to talk about scale in a moment. But one of the things that is often said about process optimization is the need for departments to talk to each other, to break down silos. But in some sectors, especially in financial services, there are silos for good reason. There are silos for regulatory requirements. We have to have Chinese walls and separate boundaries. How can we try and overcome those issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And I think the reality is the siloed structure, whilst it's sometimes necessary for other reasons, it does limit the ability to deliver that comprehensive end-to-end process transformation. And
Mm.
that shift needed is to enable and unlock that holistic, interconnected financial crime function, which then allows you to look at the customer journey across the silos. And I mean, you're right to raise it. The shift has to be strategic and carefully managed. So it's not just a free for all. And it's also not just about physically merging all the teams into one giant unit, because I think we would all agree that doesn't work. But it's about standardizing the data layer and the process flows between those teams. So achieving process visibility and data interoperability across those necessary boundaries. So a customer's risk profile, for example, can flow between department to department, or maybe flags from onboarding can inform transaction monitoring without breaking security walls. So often the failure point isn't the silo itself, it's the clumsy manual handover between the silos. So visibility across and beyond the structure.
Yeah, so I mean, I must admit, I've worked for various firms, some of which have had regulated entities, some of which have had unregulated entities in that group. And it's always the challenge to try and break down those silos where necessary, but keep them obviously where the regulation requires it. But how do we ensure we don't duplicate work? How do we make the whole process more efficient is one of I think one of the challenges that we have. Just to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please submit them via the LinkedIn chat. We'll save the last 10 minutes of this webinar for your questions. So if there's anything you want to ask, please feel free. Go ahead and submit your questions, and we will come to those in a few moments' time. One of the things we picked up on a moment ago is about the nature of the changes we're putting in place. We want to think about scale and the multipliers behind these changes. When we're looking at process optimization, are we really looking at small incremental changes and scaling them, or are we thinking about larger changes? Do you have a particular method, a strategy for implementing optimization in firms?
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to sit on the fence because I think it's a really important topic to tackle. I think when we're talking about scaling, and I'm happy to talk about scaling, but we should also talk about where we start. And I think that's probably a good place to maybe think about this. So when it comes to where first, I would say the bigger the process, the bigger the engine, the best place it is to start, because the more roadblocks and deviations you're going to see in the true process. So if I was to maybe pick an example, KYC or CDD, we know that they are cumbersome processes, often very manual, quite resource intensive. But I also think the important thing when it comes to KYC is that it's also the point at which an organization receives the most current, enriched, and accurate data about the customer, more than at any other point in the customer journey. And it has an impact on all the other processes, whether it's financial crime or even wider. And right now, operationally, most institutions are still grappling with fragmented, manual processes because their data is scattered, or maybe not well integrated, or they are heavily reliant on, say, periodic calendar-based reviews, which means that if a customer's profile suddenly spikes mid-year, or even straight after a periodic review has been carried out, the system might not flag it until the next scheduled review, which could be months, if not years later, which leaves a massive blind spot, right? So the future state of process optimization helps you get from moving CDD or KYC away from that kind of static snapshot view towards data-driven real-time monitoring. The concept of perpetual KYC has been talked about a lot, but actually, if you've got, let's not talk about the end state. Let's talk about what we need to fix now to be able to unlock that end state, and that's really where we need to start focusing our efforts. So, process insights gives you that standardized data inputs, right? And then building around that, which will then give you the effectiveness and then the amplification of that. So when it comes to scale, okay, if we say CDD KYC maybe is a great starting point, but when we talk about scale, the concept starts to deliver true exponential value when you start thinking about scale multipliers. You start compounding the benefits that emerge as your optimization implementations extend across processes, across departments, across business functions. And that tipping point really occurs when you've got around 5 connected processes. And that's when you start seeing the benefits multiply as insights from one area inform improvements in other areas. And that advantage comes from treating process optimization not as an isolated point and not as an isolated project, but as an enterprise-wide transformation. So when financial crime teams optimize transaction monitoring, those improvements cascade into investigations, case management, regulatory reporting, and the customer experience. So each optimized process becomes the foundation for the next. And it creates a virtuous cycle where that marginal improvement compounds into genuine transformational change. So some financial institutions that have implemented process optimization successfully and at scale have reported 30% reduction in people hours for manual processes through automation, 50% improvements in operational efficiency for KYC processes. So the value is real, the impact is real, but it does take some strategic initiative to really start focusing on this and not seeing it as a project, but seeing it as an ongoing enhancement.
One of the things that has really struck me over the last few months is how many of the big banks have these massive fines for various failures. There's this huge remediation project where all of a sudden we have to find contractors, bringing them in, working through a huge backlog because something's fallen over. Do you often find that process optimization can run parallel to remediation projects? Should it come afterwards? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think when it comes to remediation specifically, and you think about remediation is a classic example, right? You've got a process that's well defined that you're going to run over and over again for a finite population, and you're going to throw a lot of individuals at it. You're going to throw a lot of technology at it. So it works hand in hand. If you think about firms nowadays, they are using automated data-driven remediation services. So if we take the classic example of electronic ID verification validation, that in itself as a solution streamlined things enormously. And the numbers back it up. So one retail bank who used automated validation checks during a big remediation project reported operational savings of 50%. And the benefit there is that something like, I think it was 75% of individuals passed the automated check straight away. So if you optimize your process before you go into the remediation, your remediation is then being executed on a much more streamlined process, which is still effective. Actually, at the end of that, you're going to get an enhanced outcome because you're not following steps that are not required, but you're also going to complete it at a lower cost and much more efficiently.
And I guess the reason for many of the remediations is because something has fallen over with the existing process. So I guess that transparency will hopefully try and alleviate future issues.
Exactly. I think the point I'd make here is to say it's really at this point where process mining and intelligent automation really start working together to form almost a tight feedback loop. Once process mining identifies those high volume, repetitive manual steps, you've got automation that then says, okay, this is how I'm going to, you've optimized the process. This is how I'm going to make it a lot more efficient and automated. So if you take, say, initial reviews for transaction monitoring alerts, that initial review process looks at alert review, data gathering for investigations, generating case logs, That's where RPA, robotic process automation, can really step in and add a smart layer on top of existing, often legacy systems to handle those tasks much more efficiently.
Interesting. So another thing that often is associated with process optimization and changes to process is a slight fear that it could become a lean project, that numbers could be cut and department budgets maybe tightened a little bit. Does that impact upon the organizational culture? Do you find resistance to the implementation of process optimization because there is this association around maybe cuts to budgets or headcount?
Yeah, so I don't think that the apprehension towards adopting this concept necessarily comes from the fear of it leading directly to a loss of resource or a loss of jobs. I don't even think that's necessarily the case. I think what this unlocks as a benefit is the ability to reallocate your resources to the more pertinent and the more value add tasks that you have within the organization. The whole point here is remove the resource from the wasted effort, the steps that are not needed, the things you're doing right now, which don't add any value and don't even take you to that ultimate end state of really finding or fighting the bad guy. That's a lot of the steps that we carry out today in organizations don't even come close to achieving that. What they're actually doing is just ticking a box because we've once decided that that's going to be a box that needs ticking. But the point around challenge that you say is an important one. And I think that the hurdles often seem less about the technology and more about the, say, organizational complexity and the culture. And I think the first barrier that kind of comes up again and again is data quality. And data quality is something which, many organizations, especially in the UK, have legacy issues. Acquisitions have taken place, mergers have taken place. You've got legacy systems. Data is unstructured, messy, siloed, and it's not easily searchable. So, and they don't invest enough to fix the root causes behind that. It's seen as this huge, daunting task. So you can't really start a truly data-driven initiative like process mining without really cleaning up the data and the foundation that you're going to put into it first, right? And one of the other issues that you touched on, which is organizational structure and the siloed operations, we talked about that slightly earlier, which is you have these specialized teams, and that siloed structure is what sometimes is necessary, but really leads to some inefficiencies along the way as well. And how to unblock that is really key.
So turning to the culture, how can we win over some of the senior leaders, some of the people that think, well, I've had this process for a long time. They're rather resistant to changing what they do. Any tips on winning these key decision makers over?
Yeah. And look, this is so important, right? When we talk about this type of a transformation, it just needs, we're talking about something that could be 5 years up to 10 years worth of ongoing change that to really drive out that efficiency. So it takes, without a doubt, strong executive sponsorship. There needs to be clear communication about the strategic narrative. What are we actually trying to achieve here? If the business unit leaders don't buy into it, if the strategic direction feels fuzzy or changes every year, like we see in some organizations, these complex initiatives, they just stall out. And I think I mentioned it earlier, where you can't see it as a single project. You have to see it as a genuine innovation and an ongoing evolution, right? So when it comes to shaping future transformation programs and the focus on how to enhance the operating model, I think what financial institutions must firstly define is, what does their ideal future look like? What's your desired speed for onboarding? What's your target accuracy for alert handling? What's your desired customer experience? The customer is at the heart of a lot of conversations that we have today. What do you want that customer journey to feel like? So define the destination first. And only then can you call out all those tactical actions, the immediate fixes for pain points, which actually align to your future strategy. So you need to act tactically, yes. Fix what is burning now, but you have to think strategically about your ultimate process goal. And I guess one of the things I would highlight here is change how you measure success. That has to shift away from, say, just counting things like how many of these have we done and how many SARs have we filed. And we can talk about SARs as perhaps one of the most ineffective processes you see. If you think globally, millions and millions of SARs are filed every single year, with I think less than 1% achieving prosecution. Honestly, as a business, would you accept that as a return rate on any other core function within your business? A 1% success rate? You just wouldn't, but we accept it. So how you measure success needs to change towards actual effectiveness. You've got bodies like the FATF, the FCA. The focus is increasingly shifting towards effectiveness assessments, not just tick box compliance. And so your success has to align to the quality of outcomes. Are we actually reducing risk? Are we actually identifying real financial crime? And not just by outputs like volumes of SARs filed. So that pathway is key, and defining that before you start thinking about what you want to automate. And I think that strategy is what I would encourage leaders within the organization to start thinking about.
Brilliant. So just a reminder, if anybody has any questions, now's the time to submit them. We've got a few moments left. So if you get your questions in, we'll try and cover them. One thing that really struck me is about this emergence of the importance of MI, management information. We're seeing lots of movement by the FCA. They're starting to emphasize the importance of management information. With process optimization, if we're really looking afresh at the processes we have, does that give us a good opportunity to really start measuring the various requirements, the cases? And is this an opportunity to actually improve our MI as we do this?
Without a doubt. So I think it's a natural next step when it comes to the benefits and the value of process optimization. You get real. If everything I'm doing as in an organization or as the functional leader of a department is backed up by data, and all that data is feeding into dashboards, which can be defined in any way that you see fit, if in terms of what you want to use the data for, then what you're achieving is I would argue much easier discussion to have when you're having, say, an exco meeting, to say, here's my dashboard. It contains all my data, and it's all factual, data-driven insight, as opposed to me having an opinion on what I think is not working. And I think that just sends a much more powerful image to say, I know where my problems lie. I know what I need to fix, and it's all driven by the data. It's not an opinion. It creates a lot less challenge in some of those senior conversations where you have to demonstrate value. If you can then go one step further and say, by unblocking that step, which I know is taking X number of days or X number of hours more than it probably should, and the number of people I've got working on that step, actually that results in a value, a monetary value, which I think every senior leader will probably look at in a much more favorable way.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I guess it's really emphasizing the importance of data points, and also real metrics that senior leaders can use to evidence the improvements that have made as a result of process optimization. Madhav, thank you so much for joining me today. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to have another inCONVERSATION, and this is going to be with Rachel Walcote and Lindsay Rogerson. We're going to be talking about the role of investigative journalism in financial crime prevention. So we're going to be looking at the role that journalists play. Often this is quite understated, so we want to explore this in light of some of the big cases that we've seen over the past few years. Thank you so much for joining me wherever you've joined from around the world. Have a very good rest of day, and see you next time. Goodbye.